3 months into what was supposed to be our journey together through my recovery, I discovered Emma had found herself a new climbing partner. Not just any partner, but Ryan, the guy who could still scale a 512 route while I struggled to walk up a flight of stairs without wincing. But here's what I learned about hitting rock bottom when you're already down. Sometimes the fall teaches you how to build wings. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Phoenix had always been our playground. Emma and I spent 3 years conquering every climbing route from Camelback Mountain to the towering red rocks just outside the city. We were that couple other climbers envied. The ones who moved together like we shared the same heartbeat, anticipating each other's moves on the wall with an almost telepathic connection. When I think back to those days, I remember how Emma would laugh when I'd insist on checking her harness twice before any climb. How she'd roll her eyes but never stop me from being protective. I thought that protectiveness went both ways. Was 28 when it happened, Emma 26, and we'd been talking seriously about moving in together. Our relationship had this comfortable rhythm where I'd pick her up every morning at 5:30 for our training sessions at Iron Valley CrossFit. Then we'd grab breakfast at Mountain Brew Caf before she headed to her personal training clients. And I settled into my home office for graphic design work. Weekends meant road trips to new climbing destinations. Her filming content for her Instagram while I captured the perfect shots of her conquering routes that would make her followers swoon with envy. Emma had built quite the following online. Nearly 50,000 people who hung on her every post about fitness, nutrition, and adventure. I was proud of her success, even if it meant I occasionally had to wait while she set up the perfect shot or retook a video 5 times to get the lighting just right. She called me her secret weapon, the photographer behind her best content, though she rarely tagged me in posts. When I asked about it once, she laughed and said her followers preferred the mystery. The idea that she was this independent adventure goddess who needed no one. I should have paid more attention to that phrase. Needed no one. The accident happened. On a Saturday morning in October, we were tackling a route at South Mountain that Emma wanted to feature in a collaboration with a gear company. It was rated a 510, well within both our capabilities. But the Arizona wind had picked up overnight, making the rock face unpredictable. I was leading the climb, about 30 feet up, when a hold that had seemed solid simply crumbled away. Beneath my weight, the fall itself wasn't catastrophic, but the way I landed. With my left leg twisted beneath me and my knee bending in a direction knees were never meant to bend. I knew immediately something was seriously wrong. Emma rappelled down faster than I'd ever seen her move, her face pale with concern as she knelt beside me on the rocky ground. Her hand shook as she called for emergency services, and I remember thinking, even through the haze of pain, that this was probably the most scared I'd ever seen her. She rode with me in the ambulance, holding my hand while the paramedics worked, whispering that everything would be okay, that we'd get through this together. The diagnosis was a complete ACL tear with additional damage to my meniscus. Surgery was scheduled for the following Tuesday with a recovery timeline that made my stomach drop. 6 months minimum before I could even think about climbing again. Possibly longer, depending on how well the physical therapy went. The surgeon, Dr. Peterson, was optimistic but realistic. Young, healthy patients typically recovered well, but it would require dedication, patience, and a strong support system. Emma squeezed my hand when he said that last part. He's got that. She told Dr. Peterson with a confidence that warmed my heart. We're a team. The surgery went smoothly, but recovery was brutal in ways I hadn't anticipated. The first few weeks were a fog of pain medication and frustration. Simple tasks like showering became elaborate productions requiring planning and assistance. Helped initially bringing me meals and helping me navigate the basics of daily life with crutches, but I could see the strain it put on her routine. Her morning workouts got pushed later, her client sessions rescheduled, and her content creation suffered from the irregular schedule. I tried to be understanding. Emma's career depended on consistency, on maintaining the image of this always active, always available fitness guru. Her followers expected daily posts, workout videos, adventure content, and I was suddenly this anchor slowing everything down. When I suggested she get back to her normal routine and that I could manage on my own, she protested. but I caught the relief in her eyes. "Are you sure?" she asked, and I could tell she'd been hoping I'd say exactly that. "I'll be fine," I assured her. "You've got your life to live. I can't expect you to put everything on hold for me." Looking back, that might have been the moment I signed my own walking papers without realizing it. Emma did try, at least for the first month. She'd stop by after her morning sessions, bringing me lunch and updating me on gym gossip. She'd help me with the basic physical therapy exercises the clinic had prescribed for home practice, though I could see her impatience when I struggled with movements that should have been simple. When I couldn't manage more than 10 minutes on the exercise bike without my knee swelling, she'd suggest maybe I wasn't pushing myself hard enough. When the physical therapist recommended I take an extra rest day after overworking the joint, Emma wondered aloud if I was using the injury as an excuse to be lazy. Those comments stung, but I pushed them aside. Emma was a fitness professional. She was used to working with people who could match her intensity. I was probably being oversensitive reading criticism where she meant encouragement. The first real crack in our foundation appeared in November, about 6 weeks post-surgery. Emma had been invited to a weekend climbing competition in Sedona. It's a significant opportunity for her brand since it would be filmed for a outdoor sports documentary. She'd initially declined, saying she couldn't leave me alone for a whole weekend. But I could see how much the opportunity meant to her. "Go," I told her. "I'll be fine for 2 days." "Really?" The eager hope in her voice was unmistakable. "Really, this is huge for your career. I'll just binge some shows and work on client projects." She kissed me with more enthusiasm than she'd shown in weeks. "You're the best, Jake. I'll make it up to you when I get back." Emma left Friday morning, her gear bag packed with enough equipment for a week-long expedition. She texted sporadically throughout the weekend, brief updates. Between climbs and networking events, the photos she posted on Instagram showed her glowing with happiness, surrounded by other athletes who shared her passion for pushing limits and conquering challenges. In every shot, she looked like she belonged there in that world of endless possibility and physical achievement. When she returned Sunday night, she was electric with excitement. Weekend had exceeded her expectations. She'd not only performed well in the competition, but had also connected with several industry contacts who were interested in future collaborations. As she described the weekend in detail, I felt genuinely happy for her success, but also acutely aware of the gap between her experiences and my current reality. "You should have seen this one route," she said, her eyes bright with the memory. "It was this overhang that looked impossible. But once you figured out the sequence, it was like dancing on the rock." Ryan Walsh, that guy who's sponsored by Momentum? He showed me this technique for mantling that completely changed my approach. I knew Ryan by reputation. He was one of those climbers who made the impossible look effortless, a local legend who'd been featured in climbing magazines and had his own modest social media following. He was also single, something I'd heard mentioned in gym conversations, though it hadn't seemed relevant until that moment. "Sounds like you learned." "A lot," I managed, though something cold was settling in my stomach. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Oh, I did. Ryan said I have natural talent that's been underutilized. He thinks with the right training partner I could be competing at a much higher level." The way she said training partner made my chest tighten, but I pushed the feeling down. I was being paranoid, probably just jealous that someone else was filling a role I couldn't currently fulfill. Over the following weeks, Ryan's name appeared in our conversations with increasing frequency. Emma would mention techniques he'd taught her, routes he'd recommended, and advice he'd given about her training regimen. When I asked if I could meet him sometime, she brushed off the suggestion, saying he was usually too busy with his own training schedule. Meanwhile, my recovery was progressing slower than anyone had hoped. Physical therapy sessions were grueling, and despite my best efforts, I was consistently falling short of the milestones Dr. Peterson had outlined. The frustration was eating at me, but Emma's patience was wearing even thinner. When I had to cancel a dinner date because my knee had swollen up after an overly ambitious therapy session, she sighed heavily. "Jake, it's been 3 months. Shouldn't you be getting better faster than this?" "I'm trying," I said, hating how defensive I sounded. The therapist says everyone heals at their own pace. Maybe you need to try harder, Ryan said when he had his shoulder surgery. He was back to climbing in 4 months because he refused to accept limitations. That was the first time she'd directly compared me to Ryan, and it hit like a physical blow. I wanted to point out that shoulder injuries and knee injuries weren't remotely comparable, that Ryan's surgery might have been less extensive, that recovery timelines weren't something you could willpower your way through. Instead, I just nodded and promised to push myself harder in therapy. Which brought me to that Tuesday morning in December when everything changed. I was scheduled for a late afternoon physical therapy session, so I decided to surprise Emma with lunch at Iron Valley. She'd been spending more time there lately, often staying long after her client sessions to work on her own training. I thought, maybe we could grab sandwiches from the deli next door and eat together in the gym's lounge area, like we used to do before the accident. I pushed through the glass doors of Iron Valley just after noon, my walking boot making an awkward thudding sound against the rubber flooring. The main workout area was moderately busy with the lunch crowd, but I didn't immediately spot Emma among the familiar faces. I was about to check the climbing wall area when I heard her laugh from the direction of the free weight section. It was a laugh I recognized, the one she used when she was genuinely delighted by something, not the polite chuckle she'd been giving my attempts at humor lately. I followed the sound and found Emma spotting for someone on the bench press. The someone was Ryan Walsh, and the weight he was pressing was impressive enough to draw a small audience of admirers. Emma was leaning over him, her hands positioned to assist if needed, her face animated in a way I hadn't seen in months. When Ryan finished his set and sat up, she handed him a water bottle and a towel with the kind of attentive care that used to be reserved for me. "Nice job," she was saying. "You're definitely getting stronger. I can see the difference in your back development." Ryan grinned up at her, sweat glistening on his forehead. "It's all because of my amazing training partner. You push me harder than any coach I've ever had." Training partner. There was that phrase again, but hearing it applied to their relationship while watching their easy physical intimacy made my mouth go dry. I stood there for several minutes, watching them move through a workout routine with the kind of synchronization Emma and I had once shared on climbing routes. They alternated between exercises, encouraging each other, sharing water bottles, and maintaining a constant stream of conversation that looked effortless and natural. Emma looked happier than I'd seen her since before my accident. When they finished their session and headed toward the locker rooms, I quietly slipped out of the gym without announcing my presence. My surprise lunch plan felt pathetic in light of what I'd witnessed. Emma already had someone to share her midday break with, someone who could match her energy and enthusiasm, someone who wasn't hobbling around in a medical boot. That evening, when Emma came over for dinner, I decided to test the waters. "How was your day?" I asked as casually as I could manage. "Good," she replied, though she seemed distracted, checking her phone more frequently than usual. "Just the usual client sessions and some personal training." "Did you work out with anyone today?" She glanced up sharply, and for a moment I thought she might tell me about Ryan. Instead, she shook her head. "Just solo stuff today." Why? The lie hit me harder than the truth would have. She felt the need to hide her training sessions. With Ryan, it meant she knew they crossed some kind of line. I wanted to confront her directly, but something held me back. Maybe I was afraid of what else I might discover. Instead, I started paying closer attention to the details I'd been overlooking. Emma's workout clothes were frequently in the laundry, suggesting she was training more often than she'd mentioned. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages she'd read quickly and then delete. She started scheduling her visits to my apartment around times that wouldn't conflict with what she claimed were client sessions. But when I checked Iron Valley's class schedule online, those time slots were often listed as open gym hours. The breaking point came on a Friday evening in mid-December. Emma had canceled our dinner plans, claiming she had an early morning client and needed to get to bed early. I was disappointed but understanding until I decided to check her Instagram. Before going to sleep, her most recent story, posted just an hour earlier, showed her at a local restaurant with Ryan. They were sharing a dessert, laughing at something on his phone, and the caption read, "Celebrating my amazing training partner's new sponsorship deal." So proud of this guy. I stared at the screen until the story disappeared, feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. Not only had she lied about her plans, but she was publicly celebrating another man's achievements with language that felt intimate and personal. The word proud particularly stung. When was the last time Emma had expressed pride in anything I'd accomplished? I realized I couldn't remember. I spent that weekend in a dark mental space, analyzing every interaction Emma and I had shared over the past few months. The gradual decline in physical affection, the way she seemed relieved when I told her not to worry about helping with my recovery, the impatience in her voice when I struggled with basic tasks, the frequency with which Ryan's name appeared in our conversations. The signs had been there all along. I'd just been too hopeful to acknowledge them. Monday morning brought the conversation I'd been dreading but knew was inevitable. Emma arrived at my apartment earlier than usual, her gym bag slung over her shoulder and her expression more serious than I'd seen in weeks. "We need to talk," she said, and my heart sank. I knew this tone. I'd heard it in movies, read about it in books, but experiencing it in real life was a different kind of awful. Emma sat on the edge of my couch, maintaining distance between us, and took a deep breath. "Jake, I've been thinking a lot about us lately, about where we're going and what we both need right now." "Okay," I said carefully, though I wanted to skip ahead to the end of this conversation. "You're dealing with so much right now with your recovery, and I feel like my being around is just adding pressure. You need to focus on getting better, and I need to focus on my career." "What are you saying exactly?" Emma looked down at her hands. "I think we should take a break. Just temporarily while you get back on your feet. It's not fair to either of us to try to maintain a relationship when we're both struggling." The clinical way she delivered this speech made it clear she'd rehearsed it probably multiple times. I wanted to argue to point out that relationships were supposed to be about supporting each other through difficult times, not abandoning ship when things got challenging. Instead, I found myself asking the question I was most afraid to hear. Answered, "Does this have anything to do with Ryan?" Her pause lasted a second too long. "Hey, Ryan's a friend. He's been helping me stay motivated with my training while you've been recovering." "That's not what I asked." Emma stood up, slinging her bag back over her shoulder. "I think you're reading too much into things because you're frustrated with your situation. This isn't about anyone else, Jake. It's about what's best for both of us right now." After she left, I sat in my apartment staring at the space where she'd been sitting, trying to process what had just happened. The woman I'd been planning a future with had just walked out of my life with a speech that sounded like it came from a self-help book about conscious uncoupling. The worst part was that she'd managed to make it sound like she was doing me a favor. But the real devastating blow was still coming, and it would arrive courtesy of a conversation I was never supposed to hear. The brutal truth came exactly 1 week after Emma's carefully rehearsed breakup speech. I was sitting in Mountain Brew Cafe. It's the same place where we used to plan our weekend climbing adventures. Trying to work on a logo design for a client while nursing my 3rd cup of coffee. My knee was having a particularly bad day, swollen and aching despite the anti-inflammatory medication. And I decided to work somewhere other than my apartment to combat the depression that had been settling over me like Phoenix smog. I'd chosen a corner table near the back, partly for the better lighting on my laptop screen and partly because I didn't want to run into anyone I knew. The cafe was moderately busy with the usual mix of remote workers, college students, and locals catching up over lattes. I was deep in concentration, adjusting the kerning on a particularly stubborn font. When I heard Emma's voice from the table directly behind me, my first instinct was to turn around and say hello, maybe even attempt some kind of civil post-breakup interaction. But something in her tone made me pause. She wasn't using her usual public voice, the bright and energetic persona she projected. For clients and social media, this was the private Emma, the one who spoke candidly about things she'd never post online. "Honestly, Chloe, it's such a relief," Emma was saying to her friend. "I know that sounds terrible, but I couldn't keep pretending anymore. Don't have to justify anything to me," Chloe Rodriguez replied. I recognized her voice from the few times Emma had brought her around. 3 months of playing caregiver would drive anyone crazy. "You're not a nurse?" My hands froze over the keyboard. playing caregiver. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. Exactly, Emma continued, and I could hear her stirring something. It's probably one of those elaborate matcha drinks she always ordered. People kept telling me what a good girlfriend I was being. How supportive and patient, but they didn't see what it was really like. Jake became so needy and dependent. Everything revolved around his limitations. What do you mean? Chloe asked. I closed my laptop quietly, not wanting to miss a word of what was apparently Emma's true assessment of our relationship during my recovery. Like everything had to be planned around his physical therapy schedule, or whether he was having a good knee day or a bad knee day. We couldn't go anywhere that required much walking. Forget about hiking or climbing or any of the activities we used to enjoy together. I felt like I was dating an elderly person. The cruelty of that comparison made my chest tighten. I'd tried so hard to not be a burden, to encourage Emma to maintain her normal activities, even when it meant spending more time alone. Apparently, my efforts to be understanding had been interpreted as neediness. Don't even get me started. On the emotional stuff, Emma continued. He got so sensitive about everything. I'd suggest maybe he could push himself a little harder in therapy and he'd get all defensive and hurt. God forbid I mention that other people recover faster from similar injuries. You mean like Ryan? Chloe's tone suggested she knew exactly where this conversation was heading. Ryan's been such a breath of fresh air, Emma said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. Finally, someone who understands that fitness is about constantly challenging yourself, not making excuses. When Ryan had his shoulder surgery 2 years ago, he was back to full activity in 4 months because he refused to accept limitations. And he's hot, Chloe added with a laugh. Yes, that doesn't hurt, Emma laughed along, but it's more than that. Being around Jake became so draining. He'd get tired after basic activities, needed help with simple tasks, and was always complaining about pain or setbacks. I felt like I was constantly walking on eggshells, trying not to say anything that would hurt his feelings or make him feel worse about his situation. I realized my hands were clenched into fists under the table. This woman was describing me like I was some kind of invalid, a burden she'd heroically endured out of obligation rather than love. So when did things start with Ryan? Chloe asked, and my blood went cold waiting for the answer. We started training together about 6 weeks ago, Emma replied. At first it really was just training, but being around someone who's passionate and driven and physically capable again reminded me what I'd been missing. Ryan challenges me, pushes me to be better, doesn't need me to take care of him or manage his emotions. 6 weeks ago. That would have been early November, around the time Emma had started mentioning Ryan regularly in our conversations. I was struggling through physical therapy and trying not to be a burden. She was developing feelings for someone else. Have you guys, Chloe's voice trailed off suggestively. Not yet, Emma said, though her tone suggested it was only a matter of time. I wanted to end things with Jake properly first. I'm not a cheater. But Ryan and I have definitely connected on a level that Jake and I never did, even before his accident. That last part felt like a knife twisting in my chest. She was rewriting our entire relationship history to justify her current feelings. What level? Chloe pressed. Intellectual, physical, emotional. Ryan gets my ambitions. He doesn't see my career goals as vanity or unnecessary pressure, like Jake sometimes did. When I talk about wanting to compete at higher levels or build my brand, Ryan offers concrete advice and support instead of just nodding along politely. I tried to remember when I'd ever suggested Emma's career goals were vain or unnecessary. I'd always been supportive of her ambitions even when they meant less time together or required financial sacrifices on my part. Apparently my brand of support hadn't been enthusiastic enough for her liking. Plus, Emma continued, Ryan actually contributes to my content in meaningful ways. He understands how to create engaging fitness videos, knows how to spot for challenging lifts, can demonstrate advanced techniques. Jake was helpful as a photographer, but he never really understood the fitness world. My role had been reduced to that of a photographer, a hired hand rather than a partner. Never mind that I'd learned about climbing and fitness specifically. To share those interests with Emma, that I'd spent countless hours researching techniques and equipment to better support her goals. And honestly, Emma's voice dropped lower, more conspiratorial. The physical chemistry with Ryan, is incredible. We haven't even kissed yet, but there's this tension and energy that I haven't felt in years. With Jake, especially lately, it was like being with a brother or a roommate. Sweet, but not exactly passionate. The conversation continued for several more minutes, but I'd heard enough. Emma painted a picture of our relationship that made me sound like a charity case she'd generously tolerated out of pity. According to her version of events, I'd been holding her back professionally, emotionally, and physically, long before my accident. The injury had simply provided a convenient excuse to escape a relationship she'd already mentally ended. I finally heard their chairs scraping against the floor as they prepared to leave. I kept my head down, pretending to be absorbed in my laptop screen. Emma and Chloe walked past my table without noticing me, still chatting about weekend plans. That apparently involved meeting up with Ryan and his friends for a climbing trip to Sedona. I sat there for another hour after they left, staring at my blank computer screen and trying to process what I'd learned. The Emma who had just described our relationship with such casual cruelty was unrecognizable from the woman I thought I'd been building a future with. Either I'd been completely delusional about who she was, or she'd become someone entirely different when faced with the inconvenience of a partner who couldn't keep up with her lifestyle. The worst part wasn't even the revelation about Ryan, though that stung intensely. It was the realization that Emma had been performing the role of supportive girlfriend while privately resenting every accommodation she'd made for my recovery. Every time she'd helped me with physical therapy exercises, she'd apparently been thinking about how tedious and frustrating I was. Every canceled plan or modified activity had been another mark against me in her mental ledger. I thought about all the times I'd apologized for my limitations, tried to encourage her to maintain her normal routine without me, expressed gratitude for her patience and support. She'd accepted those apologies and reassurances while apparently viewing them as admissions of inadequacy rather than considerations for her needs. The drive home was a blur of anger, humiliation, and a strange sense of relief. At least now I understood why Emma had seemed increasingly distant and impatient over the past few months. At least now I knew that her decision to end our relationship hadn't been the thoughtful, mutual best-interest choice she'd presented it as. She'd simply found someone who better matched her current priorities and had been looking for an exit strategy. When I got back to my apartment, I found myself looking around with new eyes. The space still contained reminders of Emma everywhere. The climbing gear we'd accumulated together, photos from our adventures, books she'd left behind, the specialized exercise equipment she'd brought over to help with my rehabilitation. All of it now felt contaminated by the knowledge of how she'd really viewed our situation. I spent the evening systematically removing Emma from my living space. Photos went into a box in the closet. Her belongings went into a bag by the door. The exercise equipment got moved to the spare bedroom where I wouldn't have to see it daily. I wasn't ready to throw anything away, but I needed these reminders of false happiness out of my immediate environment. As I worked, I found myself replaying conversations from the past few months with new understanding. I might be babying my injury took on a different meaning when I realized she'd been comparing me to Ryan's recovery timeline. Her impatience when I needed to rest or modify activities wasn't concern for my progress. It was frustration with my limitations. Her praise for my patience and positive attitude had apparently been condescending rather than genuine. most painful realization was that Emma had been right about one thing. I had become dependent on her validation and support in ways that went beyond the physical assistance my injury required. I'd been so afraid of being a burden that I'd constantly sought reassurance that I wasn't imposing, which had probably made me seem even more needy and insecure. By the time I went to bed that night, the anger had mostly faded, replaced by a hollow sense of clarity. Emma had shown me exactly what she thought I was worth, and it wasn't much. The relationship I'd thought we were building together had been largely one-sided, sustained by my willingness to accept whatever level of engagement she was willing to provide. But along with that painful clarity came something unexpected: sense of freedom. For the first time in months, I didn't have to worry about whether my recovery timeline was disappointing someone else. I didn't have to feel guilty about needing rest days or having setbacks. I didn't have to watch Emma's face for signs of impatience when I struggled with activities that used to be easy. The woman I'd loved was gone, possibly had never existed. In the first place, maybe that meant I could stop trying to be the person she'd wanted me to be and start figuring out who I actually was beyond this injury. It would take time to untangle my self-worth from Emma's approval, but at least now I knew that was what I needed to do. The alternative was to keep accepting relationships where I was tolerated rather than valued, where my worth was conditional on my ability to meet someone else's standards for strength, independence, and convenience. I fell asleep that night, feeling more alone than I had since the accident, but also more honest with myself than I'd been in months. Tomorrow, I would start building a life that wasn't centered around making myself acceptable to someone who would never see me as enough. The next morning brought a decision that surprised even me. Instead of wallowing in the revelation from the coffee shop, I called Dr. Peterson's office and requested a referral to a different physical therapy clinic. When his nurse asked why, I simply said, I thought a change of environment might help my progress. It was partly true, though the real reason was that I needed to start over somewhere Emma had never been. Somewhere her opinions about my recovery speed and dedication hadn't contaminated the space. Desert Recovery Center was located in a strip mall in North Phoenix, far from the trendy central corridor where Emma and I had spent most of our time together. The building was newer, but less polished than my previous clinic, with motivational posters on the walls and the faint smell of industrial carpet. When I walked in for my evaluation appointment, I expected the usual routine of measurements, strength tests, and cautious optimism about my timeline. What I didn't expect was Sophie Bennett. Sophie was probably around 30, with shoulder length, brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of genuine smile that reached her eyes. More importantly, she was the first medical professional who didn't immediately focus on what I couldn't do. After reviewing my file and conducting her assessment, she sat across from me with a notepad and asked a question that caught me completely off guard. "Jake, what do you miss most about your life before the injury?" I'd been asked about pain, levels, mobility goals, and functional targets by every doctor and therapist I'd worked with. But no one had ever asked what I actually missed. The question hit me harder than I expected. "Climbing," I said without hesitation. "Not just the physical activity, but the problem-solving aspect. Each route is like a puzzle you solve with your whole body. And the trust you build with your climbing partner. The way you learn to read each other's movements and capabilities." Sophie nodded thoughtfully. "Have you considered that your rehab could incorporate some of those same elements? Problem-solving, progressive challenges, building trust in your body's capabilities again?" "I guess I've been focused on just getting back to baseline," I admitted. "Baseline is boring," Sophie said with a grin. "And honestly, it's not a very motivating goal. How about we work toward getting you better than you were before? Stronger, more aware of your body mechanics, with better injury prevention strategies." It was the first time in months that anyone had suggested I might come out of this experience improved rather than just restored. Sophie explained that many athletes used injuries as opportunities to address weaknesses they'd been ignoring, to develop better movement patterns, to build strength in supporting muscle groups they'd neglected. Our first session together was unlike anything I'd experienced in physical therapy. Instead of focusing solely on nice specific exercises, Sophie had me working on full-body movements that challenged my balance, coordination, and proprioception. She explained that climbing required total body integration, so my rehabilitation should prepare me for that kind of complex movement rather than just basic walking and jogging. "Your knee is healing well," she told me after watching me work through a series of single-leg balance challenges. "But you're babying it in ways that are actually creating compensation patterns in your hip and ankle. We need to teach your whole kinetic chain to work together again." The phrase babying, it might have triggered me a week earlier, given Emma's criticism of my approach to recovery. But coming from Sophie, it felt like useful feedback rather than judgment. She wasn't questioning my effort or dedication. She was offering technical insight about how to be more effective. Sophie also introduced me to other clients at Desert Recovery who were dealing with similar challenges. Marcus Thompson was a few years older than me, former college basketball player who'd torn his ACL in a pickup game and was working his way back to recreational league play. Unlike my previous therapy environment where I'd felt isolated in my struggles, Desert Recovery had a community atmosphere where people shared strategies and celebrated each other's progress. "The mental game is harder than the physical," Marcus told me during one of our overlapping appointment times. I spent months feeling sorry for myself and comparing my recovery to other people's timelines. It wasn't until I started focusing on what I could control that things turned around. Marcus had been where I was, consumed with frustration about limitations and setbacks. But he'd found a way through that didn't involve someone else's validation or approval. He'd rebuilt his relationship with his own body and capabilities, learning to trust the process rather than demanding instant results. Working with Sophie, I started to understand that my previous approach to rehabilitation had been passive and externally motivated. I'd been going through the motions of prescribed exercises while hoping someone else would tell me I was doing well enough, progressing fast enough, trying hard enough. With Emma, that had extended to hoping she would find my efforts acceptable and my timeline reasonable. Sophie's approach demanded active engagement and self-advocacy. She taught me to assess my own progress, to recognize the difference between productive discomfort and harmful pain, to modify exercises based on what my body was telling me rather than what I thought I should be able to do. For the first time since my accident, I felt like an active participant in my own recovery rather than a passive recipient of other people's expertise and patience. The changes weren't immediate, but they were consistent. Within 3 weeks of starting at Desert Recovery, I was managing exercises that had seemed impossible at my previous clinic. My knee swelling decreased significantly once I learned proper movement mechanics and stopped favoring the joint in ways that created additional stress. Most importantly, I began to enjoy the challenge again, rather than viewing therapy as something to endure. Sophie also introduced me to adaptive climbing techniques that could help me return to the sport safely. She'd worked with several climbers through similar injuries and understood the specific demands and risks involved, instead of telling me to wait until I was completely healed before considering climbing again. She helped me understand how to progress gradually and recognize my current capabilities. "Climbing is about reading your limits accurately," she explained, during a session where we practiced balance and reach movements that mimicked climbing positions. That's actually a useful skill for recovery too, learning to push yourself appropriately without exceeding what your tissues can handle. Through Sophie, I also met other members of the adaptive climbing community in Phoenix. There was a whole network of people who climbed with various physical limitations. From permanent disabilities to temporary injuries like mine, they gathered regularly at a gym called Vertical Ventures that specialized in adaptive techniques and had trained staff who understood how to modify routes for different capabilities. My first visit to Vertical Ventures was intimidating. I hadn't been on a climbing wall since my accident, and I wasn't sure my knee could handle the stress. But the staff there, led by an instructor named David, who climbed with a prosthetic leg, helped me understand that climbing didn't have to be an all-or-nothing proposition. "We'll start you on some easy traverse routes," David explained, referring to horizontal climbs that wouldn't stress my knee with vertical weight bearing. "Focus on rebuilding your movement vocabulary and confidence. The strength will come back faster than you think." He was right. Within an hour, I was moving across the wall with something approaching my old fluidity. My knee protested occasionally, but the movements felt natural and familiar in ways that walking and jogging still didn't. More importantly, I felt like myself again for the first time in months. The social aspect of vertical ventures was equally therapeutic. Unlike Iron Valley, where I'd felt like damaged goods compared to the elite athletes Emma surrounded herself with, this community celebrated adaptive solutions and incremental progress. People shared techniques for managing limitations, cheered each other's victories, and created an environment where asking for help was normal rather than embarrassing. I started spending several evenings a week at vertical ventures, gradually progressing from horizontal traverses to easier vertical routes as my confidence and knee stability improved. The regular climbing sessions became the anchor points of my week, something to look forward to rather than another medical appointment to endure. Sophie monitored my climbing activities and adjusted my therapy program to support them. Instead of generic knee-strengthening exercises, we worked on climbing-specific movements and positions. Instead of standard balance training, we practiced the kind of dynamic stability required for reaching difficult holds. My rehabilitation became purposeful and directly connected to my goals, rather than abstract preparation for some undefined future capability. The transformation wasn't just physical. For months, I'd been defining myself by my limitations, measuring my worth by how well I could approximate my pre-injury capabilities. Through this new community and approach, I began to see the injury as part of my climbing story, rather than the end of it. I was developing skills and awareness that I'd never had before, learning about my body and its capabilities in ways that went far beyond simply returning to my previous level. Marcus, who'd become a regular training partner at both the therapy clinic and climbing gym, noticed the change in my attitude before I did. "You're different," he told me one evening as we cooled down after a climbing session. "It's more confident, less apologetic about everything. When you first started at Dessert Recovery, you acted like you needed permission to exist. Now you're just doing the work." He was right. I'd stopped constantly questioning whether I was doing enough, trying hard enough, progressing fast enough. I'd learned to trust my own assessment of my capabilities and progress rather than seeking external validation. The irony wasn't lost on me that removing Emma's expectations and judgments from my recovery had actually accelerated my progress rather than hindering it. By February, almost 5 months post-surgery, I was climbing routes that would have been challenging for me before my accident. My knee was stronger and more stable than it had been in years. Supported by the focused strength training and movement education I'd received at Desert Recovery, more importantly, I'd developed a relationship with physical challenge that was based on intrinsic motivation and personal satisfaction rather than external approval. The old Jake had climbed to impress Emma, to be worthy of her partnership, to prove that I belonged in her world of athletic achievement. The new Jake climbed because solving movement puzzles and pushing physical limits brought me joy and satisfaction. Regardless of who was watching or approving, the first sign that my past was about to collide with my present came through a message from Marcus on a Wednesday evening in March. I was at home editing photos from a recent climbing session at Vertical Ventures when my phone buzzed with his text. "Dude, isn't that your ex at Iron Valley? She's been asking people about you." My stomach dropped. I'd been successfully avoiding any places where Emma might appear for over 3 months, carefully timing my errands and activities to minimize the chance of an awkward encounter. The Phoenix climbing community was small enough that complete avoidance was probably impossible long-term, but I'd been hoping to put off any reunion until I felt more emotionally prepared. "What kind of questions?" I texted back. "How you're doing, where you're training now, whether you're climbing again." She seemed surprised when people said you were back on the wall. I set my phone aside and tried to focus on the photos. I was editing, but my concentration was shot. Why would Emma be asking about me now? It had been almost 4 months since our breakup, long enough for her to be fully established in whatever relationship she'd moved on to. The timing felt suspicious. The answer came 2 days later in the form of a direct message on Instagram. From Emma herself. I'd forgotten that we were still connected on social media. I'd never bothered to unfollow her because I'd stopped checking her content regularly after our breakup. The message was brief and seemingly casual. "Hey Jake, I heard through the grapevine that you're climbing again. That's amazing. Would love to hear how you're doing. Coffee sometime." I stared at the message for several minutes before showing it to Sophie during my therapy session that afternoon. She read it with a neutral expression, then handed my phone back. "How does getting that message make you feel?" she asked, confused, I admitted, and suspicious. Emma was pretty definitive about ending things. Why would she want to reconnect now? What do you think might have changed? I considered the question while working through a set of single leg squats. Maybe she's having second thoughts about how things ended. Or maybe she's curious about my progress because people told her I was doing well. And how do you feel about the possibility of seeing her again? That was the question I'd been avoiding. 3 months ago, any contact from Emma would have sent me into an emotional tailspin of hope and anxiety. Now, the primary emotion was wariness rather than excitement. I'd worked too hard to rebuild my self-worth to hand it back to someone who'd dismissed me so thoroughly. "I don't think I want to," I said finally. "Not yet, anyway. Maybe not ever." "That's a perfectly valid choice," Sophie said. "You don't owe anyone access to your life, especially someone who hurt you." I decided not to respond to Emma's message immediately. Instead, I spent the weekend climbing at Vertical Ventures and thinking about how much my life had changed since December. I was stronger physically than I'd been before my accident, more confident in my abilities, and surrounded by people who valued effort and progress over comparative achievements. The idea of voluntarily stepping back into Emma's orbit felt like a potential threat to that stability. But Emma wasn't content to wait for my response. On Monday morning, she showed up at Desert Recovery Center. I was finishing up a session with Sophie when the receptionist approached us. "Jake, there's someone here asking for you. Says she's an old friend." Through the glass doors that separated the treatment area from the waiting room, I could see Emma sitting in one of the chairs, checking her phone. She looked exactly the same as she had 4 months ago, fit and polished and completely out of place in the utilitarian medical environment. "Do you want me to tell her you're not available?" Sophie asked quietly. The offer was tempting, but I realized I couldn't avoid this conversation indefinitely. Better to handle it now on my own. Turf, with Sophie nearby for moral support. "No, I'll talk to her, but can you stay close?" Sophie nodded and busied herself with paperwork at a nearby desk while I walked out to the waiting room. Emma looked up as I approached, her face brightening with what appeared to be genuine happiness. "Jake, you look incredible. I can tell you've been working hard." "Thanks," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "What are you doing here, Emma?" "I wanted to see you to talk about how things ended between us. I've been thinking about you a lot lately." We moved to a quieter corner of the waiting room, though I remained standing while Emma sat down. The physical positioning felt symbolic of the power dynamic I was trying to maintain. "I heard you're climbing again," she continued. "That's wonderful. I always knew you'd bounce back." The revisionist history in that statement was staggering. Emma had spent months expressing doubt about my commitment to recovery, comparing me unfavorably to other people's timelines, and ultimately leaving because she couldn't handle my limitations. Now she was claiming she'd always believed in my eventual success. "What do you want, Emma?" I asked directly. "I want to apologize," she said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "I handled things badly when we broke up. I was scared and overwhelmed, and I didn't give you the support you deserved during a really difficult time." "Okay," I said, waiting for her to continue. "I made a mistake, Jake. I let my fears about your recovery situation cloud my judgment about us. I've realized that what we had was special, and I threw it away because I was being selfish and short-sighted." Here it was, the apology I'd fantasized about receiving during my darkest moments after our breakup. Emma was acknowledging that she'd been wrong, admitting that she'd made a mistake in leaving me. 3 months ago, hearing these words would have felt like vindication and hope. Now they felt calculated and insufficient. "What about Ryan?" I asked. Emma's expression faltered slightly. "That didn't work out. We tried dating for a while, but it wasn't what I thought it would be. Ryan is a great training partner, but he's not relationship material. Too self-absorbed, not emotionally available. So the golden boy, who'd been such a breath of fresh air compared to my neediness, had turned out to be disappointing." If Emma saw the irony in criticizing Ryan for being emotionally unavailable when she'd abandoned me during my most vulnerable period, I'm sorry that didn't work out for you, I said, meaning it genuinely, but not in the way she probably hoped. The point is, I realized what I'd lost, Emma continued. You were always there for me, always supportive and patient. I took that for granted, and I'm sorry. Are you? I asked. Because from what I remember, you found my need for support pretty inconvenient. You told me I was being too sensitive when I struggled with my recovery timeline. You compared me to other people who healed faster. You seemed relieved when I told you to focus on your own life instead of helping me. Emma looked genuinely surprised that I was challenging her narrative. I was trying to motivate you to help you stay positive. Maybe I wasn't very good at it, but my intentions were good. Your intentions, I repeated. Emma, I overheard you talking to Chloe at Mountain Brew. I heard what you really thought about my recovery, about our relationship, about me. The color drained from Emma's face. Jake, I was venting to a friend. I said things I didn't mean, because I was frustrated and overwhelmed. Which things didn't you mean? That taking care of me was draining and tedious? That I was needy and dependent? That you felt like you were dating an elderly person? That Ryan was a breath of fresh air compared to my limitations? I was having a bad day, Emma said weakly. I didn't mean any of that. You meant all of it, I said, surprised by how calm I felt. And you know what? You were probably right about some of it. I was dependent on your approval in ways that weren't healthy. I was so afraid of being a burden that I became one. But the difference is, now I know better. Emma leaned forward, sensing an opening. It's exactly what I mean. You've grown so much, become so much stronger. We could start over, build something better than what we had before. With what foundation? I asked. Emma, when I needed you most, you left. When I was struggling with the biggest physical and emotional challenge of my life, you decided it was too inconvenient to stick around. Why would I trust you to be there for me now? Because I've learned from my mistakes, she said desperately. I know what I lost, and I won't make the same errors again. You lost someone who would have done anything for you, I said. Wait. Emma, I'm not that person anymore. I won't be anyone's convenient option or backup plan. I won't accept being tolerated instead of valued. I could see tears forming in Emma's eyes, but they didn't affect me the way they once would have. Jake, please. I know I hurt you, but don't let that destroy what we could have together. I love you. You love the idea of me, I corrected. You love having someone devoted to you, someone who makes you feel good about yourself. But you don't love me enough to stick around when things get difficult? You proved that. Emma stood up, her composure cracking. So that's it? You won't even consider giving us another chance? I'm not the same person who would beg for your approval, I said. I've learned what I'm worth, and it's more than being someone's fallback option when their first choice doesn't work out. That's not what this is, Emma protested, but her voice lacked conviction, isn't it? You dated Ryan while I was healing, realized he wasn't what you wanted, and now you're back to see if I'm still available. I'm not, Emma. Not for you, not anymore. I turned to walk back toward the treatment area, but Emma called after me. Jake, you're making a mistake. What we had was real, and you're throwing it away because you're angry. I stopped and looked back at her. What we had was real for me. For you, it was conditional. I'm not angry, Emma. I'm grateful, you taught me the difference between being loved and being convenient. That's a lesson I'll never forget. As I walked back to where Sophie was waiting, I felt lighter than I had in months. Emma's return had been a test I hadn't known I was taking, and I'd passed it. The person I'd been before my accident would have accepted her apology, grateful for another chance to prove his worth. The person I'd become knew that some chances weren't worth taking. 6 months later, I was standing at the base of Cathedral Rock in Sedona, preparing for my first outdoor climb since the accident. The red sandstone formation towered above me, its distinctive spires catching the late afternoon sun in a way that made the whole landscape glow. My climbing partner for the day was checking our gear one final time, her methodical approach to safety something I'd come to appreciate and admire. Sophie had suggested this particular route because it offered multiple exit points if my knee started bothering me, but also because it was challenging enough to feel like a real accomplishment. We'd been climbing together regularly for 3 months now, a relationship evolving, naturally from therapist and patient to climbing partners, to something deeper that neither of us had rushed to define. "How's the knee feeling?" Sophie asked, as she finished coiling the rope. "Strong," I said, and meant it. The joint that had once felt like a liability now felt like one of the most stable parts of my body, supported by months of targeted strengthening and movement education. "I'm more worried about whether I remember how to lead climb outdoors." "Muscle memory," Sophie assured me. "Plus, you've been crushing it at the gym. This is just a different kind of rock." We'd been climbing together since April, and she'd mentioned during one of our therapy sessions that she was looking for someone to explore some easier outdoor routes with. Her usual climbing partners were more aggressive than she preferred, always pushing for harder grades and longer commitments. She wanted someone who appreciated the process as much as the achievement, who understood that climbing was as much about problem-solving and mental focus as physical strength. Our first outdoor session had been tentative on both sides. Now, Sophie was careful not to push me beyond what my knee could handle. I was hyper-aware of not wanting to disappoint someone whose professional reputation was tied to helping people recover from injuries. But once we started moving on the rock, all those concerns faded away. We climbed well together, communicating clearly and moving with the kind of synchronized efficiency that takes time to develop. More importantly, Sophie never made me feel like I was being evaluated or judged. She celebrated my successes without making them seem surprising. She offered suggestions for improvement without implying that my current level wasn't good enough. Climbing with her felt like a partnership rather than a performance. Made our way up Cathedral Rock, I found myself thinking about how different this experience was from my climbing days with Emma. Back then, every outdoor trip had been partly about creating content for her social media, documenting our adventures for an audience that expected constant proof of our active lifestyle. The pressure to make every climb look effortless and Instagram-worthy had sometimes overshadowed the simple joy of moving through vertical space. With Sophie, climbing was about the immediate experience rather than how it might look to others. We took breaks when we needed them, tried moves multiple times if they felt challenging, and celebrated small victories without worrying about whether they were worth photographing. The absence of external validation as a motivation made every hold feel more solid, every movement more intentional. "Nice lead," Sophie called up to me as I finished the third pitch and set up our belay station. "You're climbing with a lot more confidence than when we started." She was right. The tentative, apologetic approach I'd brought to climbing during my early recovery had been replaced by something more assertive and self-assured. I trusted my body's capabilities again, but more importantly, I trusted my ability to assess and respond to challenges without needing someone else's approval. When we reached the summit, Sophie pulled out her phone to take a photo of the view, then handed it to me. "Want to commemorate your comeback climb?" The selfie she took of us showed to people who looked genuinely happy to be exactly where they were. No staged poses or manufactured adventure aesthetic, just the satisfied exhaustion of a good day on the rock. It was the first climbing photo I'd been in since my accident, and looking at it, I realized how much had changed beyond just my physical capabilities. "I have something to tell you," Sophie said as we started our descent. "I've been offered a position at a clinic in Colorado. It's better pay, more opportunities to work with high-level athletes closer to world-class climbing." My heart sank, though I tried to keep my expression neutral. "That sounds like an amazing opportunity." "'Tis," she agreed. "But it would mean leaving Phoenix, leaving the community I've built here, leaving you." The directness of that last statement caught me off guard. Sophie and I had been growing closer, but we'd never explicitly discussed what we meant to each other or where our relationship was heading. "What do you want to do?" I asked. "I want to stay," she said simply. "I've realized that the best opportunities aren't always the ones that look most impressive on paper. Sometimes they're the ones that let you build something meaningful with people who matter to you." We finished the descent in comfortable silence, both processing the implications of what she'd shared. By the time we reached the parking area, I knew I needed to be equally direct about my feelings. "Sophie, these past few months have been the happiest I've been in years," I said. "Not just because of the climbing, but because of who I am when I'm with you. You make me feel like the best version of myself." "You do the same for me," she replied. "I've dated climbers before, but I've never had a partner who celebrated my achievements the way you do, who encouraged me to try things that scared me. We decided to make it official over dinner that night at a small restaurant in Sedona.
Oh.
No grand gestures or dramatic declarations, just two people who'd found something worth committing to. Sophie turned down the Colorado position the following week, choosing instead to open her own practice in Phoenix with a focus on adventure sports rehabilitation. A year later, Emma sent me a wedding invitation. She'd apparently found someone who met her criteria for marriage material, a successful entrepreneur who shared her interest in fitness and adventure travel. I felt nothing but genuine happiness for her when I saw the announcement. She'd found someone who could give her what she needed, and I'd found someone who valued what I had to offer. The difference was that Sophie had chosen to be with me during challenging times, not despite them. She'd seen me at my most vulnerable and uncertain, and had helped me discover strengths I didn't know I possessed. Our relationship was built on mutual support and shared growth rather than convenience or conditional approval. Standing at the altar 6 months later, watching Sophie walk down the aisle in her simple white dress, I understood that my injury had been the best thing that ever happened to me. Not because suffering was inherently valuable, but because it had forced me to learn the difference between being needed and being wanted, between being tolerated and being treasured. Emma had taught me what I wouldn't accept. Sophie had shown me what I deserved. That turned out to be the most valuable lesson of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Let's click and check them out.